Unless he was building it to keep it out.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, man.
Well, actually, a lot of places, specifically that. So originally today, we've been looking at dreams and visions in the Bible and seeing just some different things that they can teach us. And we just got through spending a number of weeks in Genesis 40 and on with Joseph's dreams, and then the baker and cupbearer's dreams, and all of those stories. Very, very interesting. Today we're going to be looking at Judges 5 and 6 with Gideon, but not Gideon's dream, because Gideon doesn't have a dream, but somebody else's dream in that story. And so one of the things, again, that I find interesting is with Joseph, Joseph has a dream, but then you find three secular, if you will, non-Israelite, non-God's people that have dreams, and how God works within their mind, their brain, their visual to give them something that then can pull Joseph in. Joseph interprets their dreams for them, and ends up in the second command. So I bring that up because this may not be the thoughts that other people have, but I don't know, I guess growing up, this message was given to me, or at least I interpreted it this way, that God generally just works through his people. Now, he affects the world, but he does it through his people. And when we open up many passages in the Bible, God is working with secular people, with even pagans. And he's working within their mind, within their peoples, et cetera, et cetera. And so we find that happening here in Judges 6 with Gideon. I said 5 and 6, it's 6 and 7. So turning to Judges chapter 6 and verse 17. I'm sorry, not 17. We're gonna start in verse 1. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, marauders from Midian, Amalek, and people of the east would attack Israel, camping in the land and destroying crops as far away as Gaza. They left the Israelites with nothing to eat, taking all the sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These enemy hoarders, coming with their livestock and tents, were as thick as locusts. They arrived on droves of camels too numerous to count. And they stayed until the land was stripped bare. So Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. And then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. So before we get to the story of Gideon and the dream that this Midianite man in the army has, I don't know, has it ever crossed your mind in the sense that everything that is happening, not only is God aware of it, but because of Israel's actions, their lifestyle, their disobedience, the Lord handed them over to the Midianites, not for 6 months or for a year, but 7 years. This is happening. And it's happening because of their disobedience, because of their lack of reverence and holiness and honoring of God. And I haven't asked a question yet, but I mean, what do you think about that? Because of Israelites' actions, God hands them over to the Midianites, and it's not like they're subdued a little bit. But the way this whole thing is described, this is radical. This is intense, what happens to Israel as a result of the Midianites and them being handed over to them. They had to find hiding places for themselves, mountains, caves, strongholds. They completely destroyed their land, their crops. They left the Israelites with nothing. I mean, it was almost much like what Israel dealt with in Genesis with not Israel because they weren't Israel yet, but with the famine where they had nothing to eat. Here in this story, and for those of you that just came in, we're in Judges 6. They left Israel, the last part of verse 4, with nothing to eat. They took their sheep, their goats, their cattle, their donkeys, took everything. They would come in with their livestock and tents. They were as thick as locusts. They arrived on droves of camels too numerous to count. And they stayed until the land was stripped bare. Israel was reduced to starvation. So when we look at stories like this, it's quite interesting that again, sometimes we get very not just caught up, but we get so mindful of getting into Gideon and God's calling of Gideon, Israel crying out. But when you look at the state of affairs, holy cow, they were in a bad place. And this is after, 7 years. Yeah.
Another example of God letting us dig ourselves into a real big hole, so that when he comes to help us, we know that it's him.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with us. It's God.
Yeah. Great point. And in fact, even kind of preceding that thought is that before, apparently, not only did they not ask God for help, but they didn't have any reverence or honor for God at all because of their actions. And now they're calling out to him, help us, come to our rescue, kind of thing. So you go from no honor at all to not just honoring, but, crying out for help. And it's been stated many, many times that the book of Judges is this, this ebb and flow of humanity, specifically Israel. And they're faithful, and then they're faithful, and then they go into this dishonoring of God for however long, and they get down here where it's terrible, and then they cry out to God, and God delivers them with a deliverer, and then they're faithful. And it's just this thing, which reminds you of what? Humanity. Judges is a picture of humanity, of what we do often. Yeah, Les. Hey, good to have y'all back, by the way.
Oh, thanks. I wondered if maybe they get to depending on themselves.
Yeah. Well, but you know, and great point. And I think if we depend upon ourselves and we don't either recognize God, we don't honor God, we don't ask God for anything, isn't that dishonoring God? And if we allow ourselves to only to be directed by our own thoughts and desires, then I think we're going to end up with Galatians 5, with the works of the flesh. We're going to want what we want. I was watching a video the other day about the impact that iPhones and devices and electronics and all that stuff definitely has its place. I mean, I'm up here using an iPad, but the impact that that's had on our culture in the sense of absolute instant gratification. You know, I want it now. You know, as much as I joke about my driving, and for you guys, I grew up driving in Houston, and so that's a part of my DNA. And when I get into places where, you know, people in a 40-mile-an-hour speed area drive 40 miles an hour, you know, it's a thing. But that's a part of my DNA. And I was driving around yesterday, and I don't know, I probably think too much about things. But I was, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 cars back. I think I was on Hit Road around 17th, which is not a great place for impatience. And the light turned green. And I'm sitting there, and I don't know, I kind of look ahead, and I'm waiting for the first person to go, and the second person, the third person, and nobody's moving, nothing's happening. And I'm just sitting there squeezing the steering wheel going, first of all, what are you doing? You're just sitting there. It's green. Would you just go already? And then I thought, what is my problem? Why do I need this to move so quickly? And I know what my problem is, but it's still an interesting question for me. So I go through all that to say that whenever we allow ourselves to be driven by ourselves, we end up with jealousy and selfishness and the humanity that comes out of us. And I think that's what we find with Israel. Doing evil in the Lord's sight, that they didn't need him, they don't want him, they're fine where they are. And so God hands them over to the Midianites for these 7 years. And one last thing, and this may be not just overstating, but, you know, being over curious. You know, it's 7 years. And 7 for Hebrews was a complete number. So, you know, this being handed over to the Midianites is going to complete this discipline that Israel's going to have. And again, if you read through this, I mean, if you read this and it wasn't a Bible story, you would go, those poor people, that discipline's too intense. You just need to back off. But it is in the Bible. It is about God's discipline of Israel. So verse 6, so Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites, and then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. And when they cried out to the Lord because of Midian, and the answer's right there in front of us, but what does the Lord do when they honor him by crying out for help? What does he do? He loves them. He's merciful toward them. He sends help. So it may seem like a small thing, but for me, it is so encouraging when we find this happening over and over and over again throughout Scripture, that even when our past and even our yesterday past has been dishonoring of God in some way, whenever we are humbled and we do cry out to God, God is there to help us. He's there to bless us and guide us and all those kind of things. So, John, brother, it's good to see you. Hope you're feeling a little bit better. Good. What's that?
Glad to be
Oh, glad to be here. I thought you said I just got a fever. Go home. No, it's good to see you. So the Lord sends a prophet to the Israelites. Now I have a feeling the way my brain is going today, we might not even get to this dream, because this is such a cool story and it has a lot of really, really cool layers. This is what the Lord, again, Yahweh and Adonai put together, Jehovah, the God of Israel, says, I brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you. I drove out your enemies and gave you their land. I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live, but you have not listened to me. I don't know if you've also ever noticed this, but it seems like regardless of where Israel is in terms of the time scale, what is almost always what God brings up in terms of what he has done for Israel and who he is. What does he almost always bring up? I brought you out of Egypt. So he takes their minds, sometimes even decades, a century before, and says, remember that event? Yeah, I did that. I brought you out. I freed you from, rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you, drove out the enemies and gave you the land that you are now in. I am the Lord your God. I am sovereign. I am able to do these things. And so I told you, don't worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now live. You didn't listen to me. And that word there for listen, if I remember, at least in the Hebrew, isn't just the idea of hearing and taking in information and then mechanically doing it, but it's the idea of listening, understanding, processing, getting it so that you understand we are to only serve Yahweh, only honor him and not the gods of the Amorites. So you didn't listen, you didn't take it in, you didn't understand what I was saying to you. I just had a little tiny epiphany. That's kind of cool. So verse 11, and for our visitors, if you guys have a comment, I don't necessarily do the whole hand raising thing, just say, hey, Andy, and start talking. So verse 11, the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath a great tree of Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Anybody proud of me right now? For those of you who giggled, thank you. You get what I'm saying. Gideon, the son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of the winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. So even after we get in verses 1 through 6, and I know we just read it, but what is Gideon here doing while being completely taken over by these Midianites after Israel has called out to Yahweh? What is he doing?
taking all the food.
What's that?
You're taking all the food.
Yes, Midianites are taking all the food. What is Gideon doing? He's doing work and he's hiding this stuff. He's hiding food so that people can have it. He's being this rebel against the Midianites. Hiding food so that they can have some. So the angel of the Lord appears to him and says, this kind of also reminds us when you look at, I think it's 1 Kings 6 with Elisha and his prophet, that he was hiding other prophets from Jezebel. And he had like 100 in this cave and 100 in this cave, and he was feeding them and watering them and taking care of them so that Jezebel wouldn't find him and kill him. So here, Gideon's doing much the same thing. So the angel of the Lord appears to him and says, and here from our study, 2 months ago, the angel of the Lord shows up here and has this conversation with Gideon. Mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Sir Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Why are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Where are all the miracles? Didn't they say the Lord brought us out of Egypt? So the ancestors even begin with the same thing that God does. This is the Lord. This is the Yahweh that brought us out of Egypt. But now the Lord has abandoned us, handed us over to the Midianites. So before we get to verse 14, how interesting it is that we find this humanity and this interesting exchange that even Gideon says, you're the God who brought us out of Egypt. Why would you abandon us? Why would you leave us and hand us over to the Midianites? What is Gideon here missing?
They abandoned him.
They abandoned him. They kind of dishonored God first. Not in terms of first, and you hit me first, but they abandoned God. How does Gideon not process that? How does he not see that?
He's human.
He's human? Absolutely. Ty?
We're your people. It doesn't matter what we do. You're supposed to take care of us.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that even today as Christians.
Yeah. Regardless of what we do, you're supposed to take care of us.
Israel did evil on the side of the Lord. That doesn't mean every single person in Israel
Right.
did evil.
Right. Yeah. Good point. And we don't know how long it's been. I've said this many times, and it has really impacted me. It may not go over your head, but it may not be something that necessarily hits you the same way. But we may read through, 30 verses, and there may be 50 years of history that has gone by since that happened. So it's not as if, on Monday that they are being mistreated, Tuesday they cry out, and Wednesday Gideon is called. It's very possible that, Gideon grew up in this. It's been 7 years. I'm saying that was a big part of his formative life in terms of Gideon oppressing Israel. Otherwise, why would Gideon say, hey, if this is a God that pulled us out of Egypt, why is he not here? Why is he not taking care of us? Because he's surrounded by these high places, these idols, and them giving their allegiance to the Midianite gods and not to Yahweh. So the Lord. So 14, then the Lord turned to him and said, go with the strength that you have, rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. But Lord, Yahweh, Gideon replied, how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in the entire family. So 3 bazillion lessons have been done on this idea. But how many times has God called you to something and you literally, not just why me, but why are you calling me? I mean, I can think of 10 people in my head right now that are better equipped, better gifted to do what you're asking me to do. Why me? And what a great lesson, what a great thought that why is God calling Gideon in this moment? And I ask this because there's not really an answer. Why is God calling Gideon?
To prove that God is the one that's doing it, not me.
Yeah. Because God is calling him.
A warrior.
Yeah, he did. That's right. Yeah, great, mighty warrior. The Lord is with you. So what does God know about Gideon that Gideon doesn't know about Gideon?
He's got to be afraid.
Yeah, a lot. So, as I mentioned this last Sunday that sometimes as I'm singing a song and I realize that there's this note that I don't believe I can hit, but there's later on in the song the same very note that I hit fine because my brain won't let me hit it here, but I do hit it here. And how oftentimes in our lives does God call us to things and you got the wrong person? So we're telling our creator and our designer, you don't know me, which is really what Gideon is saying here. Not only am I not very gifted and talented, my clan is the weakest, and I'm the weakest in that clan. So the Lord says, verse 16, I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. It's interesting how this theme just continues to move on throughout the Old Testament and probably in other literature as well. Does Gideon here remind you of anybody? Yeah. You're going to help Israel get out of Egypt. I can't speak, and I'm not this, and I'm not that. You chose the wrong guy, and your plan's wrong. And this whole conversation that they have. Here, the very same thing is happening to Gideon. I will be with you. You will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. So Gideon says, verse 17, if you are truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. Don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you. When was the last time you read this story? I mean, it's been a while for me. And as I read through this, I'm like, wow, this is really complicated. This is complex. It's not just there's this conversation, God has it with Gideon, and then boom, everything works out great. Much like Moses. God calls Moses. Moses says, let's do it. And he goes in there, and a week later, Israel's out of Egypt. And how oftentimes for each one of us, whenever God calls us to do things, big, moderate, small, whatever it is, and we're not talking about a day or a week. We're talking about months and years that God works on us and develops us to get us to a place. And even when we get to that place, we're still like, I don't know. Yeah, that's.
Just reminded me of where Jesus says, come and follow me, and the guy says, wait a minute, I gotta go.
Yeah.
And we can make excuses like that. Well, wait till I'm, in my 50s, and then I'll serve you, or whatever we do.
Yeah. How much do you think in your life that fear affects your faith? Fear affects moving forward in terms of how we're going to be perceived, the success of what we do, and maybe I'm naming my own fears. How much does fear affect you guys in the times that God calls you to do stuff, and how many times we may say no, because we're afraid. I don't know that we ever necessarily question God. We question ourselves like Gideon does here. And so Gideon, again, much like Moses, he puts before God, I'm going to come and bring you this offering, which is very interesting because it seems as though all of Israel, who were they making offerings to? Midianite gods. And here Gideon says, please don't go anywhere to this angel until I bring an offering for Yahweh. And so Gideon hurried home, and I believe it was, a while back we were doing a lesson about some offering, and Bob made the point that this wasn't like a 5 or 10 minute process. This took some time. Gideon hurried home, cooked a young goat, basket of flour. He baked some bread and without yeast, carried the meat in a basket and the broth. Oh, it was Abraham with his angelic visitors in Genesis. That's what it was. He brought them out, presented them to the angel who was under the great tree. And the angel of the Lord said to him, place the meat and the unleavened bread on the rock, pour the broth over it. Gideon did as he was told. How interesting as to kind of juxtapose that up against Israel and however long they had been offering and honoring the Midianite gods. Gideon does all of these things for this angel of the Lord. Place the meat and the unleavened bread on the rock, pour the broth over it. Gideon did that. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the bread with the tip of the staff in his hand. So from our study of angels, which again, the translation should be messengers, is this messenger visible and possibly has, skin? In other words, he's a messenger that's human. What's that? Yeah. So he's got this staff, touches the stuff. So apparently this messenger is a visible person in front of him, goes through this whole conversation, touches the meat and the bread with the tip of his staff in his hand. Fire flamed up from the rock, consumed all that he had brought, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. This is a little bit into the weeds, but whenever God would consume sacrifices, do you remember how he did it? I was going to say under the old law, we're still there. Do you remember how he did that? He did it with fire from heaven. So what we find happening with Nadab and Abihu was not, I always thought that was abnormal because I'd never considered that that's how God did sacrifices. He would consume it, fire from heaven. With Elijah and the prophets of Baal, when Elijah prayed that God would do it and show his glory and show that Elijah was a prophet, he did that. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the altar and the sacrifice. So here the fire comes from what? His staff, this angel's staff that consumed all that he had. And so fire consumes this altar. It's interesting if you ever have the time and you think about it, all the times that Jesus talks about fire, that he refers to fire consuming things. And so it seems to be more of a metaphor, because as he would talk about fire to these Israelite audiences, they got it. They understood what he was talking about, because the same thing was done in these times. And then the angel of the Lord disappeared, just gone. So then Gideon realized that it was an angel of the Lord, and he cried out. What an interesting part here. He cried out, O sovereign Lord, Lord of everything, Yahweh, I'm doomed. I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face, which seems to indicate a couple things to us. And what are some of those things that indicates to us? As Gideon is having this entire conversation, we know it's an angel of the Lord, but does Gideon? Apparently doesn't. Evidently not. Because now all of a sudden he's like, whoa, that was an angel of the Lord, because this dude just disappears. I mean, he doesn't leave, he just poof, he's gone. And then Gideon here realizes not only that it was an angel of the Lord, but he had seen an angel of the Lord face to face. So what was their belief about seeing and being around angels of the Lord? You're going to die if you're, and apparently an angel was, representative of Yahweh, which they could not look at face to face, i.e. Moses at Sinai. So Gideon thought he was dead, which is interesting how we think as humans. What did God just call Gideon to do? Save Israel from the Midianites. But now in Gideon's mind, I saw an angel and I'm going to die. I'm done. It is all right. Do not be afraid. You will not die. You're good. Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and named it Yahweh Shalom. The Lord is peace. Or in some situations, Jehovah Shalom. The altar remains in Ophrah, in the land of the clan of Abiezer to this day. So that night the Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, one that is 7 years old. Pull down your father's altar to Baal. Cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. So we're obviously not going to finish this today. But as I was going through this, notice the different clumps of things that are happening within the story. This is a very thick, interesting story. You have the offering that Gideon gives to this angel that he doesn't know is an angel yet. It just simply tells him what is coming and what's going to happen. And then here he's going to tear down his father's altar to Baal, to the Midianites' God. So we'll finish this next week, Lord willing, and hopefully get to the actual dream that this Midianite has and some really, really cool things about that. Any closing thoughts? I want to encourage all of us that our God is no different. Yahweh is no different. You know, he's going to call us to do things that aren't simple, that challenge us. And may we honor him by saying, you know, he knows me, he designed me, he made me, so whatever it is he's calling me to do, not only does he know I can do, but it's almost already done. In the sense that when this angel calls Gideon to deliver Israel from the Midianites, it's already done. And I know it wasn't done in actual time, but it's already been accomplished because Gideon wasn't going to do it. God was going to do it through Gideon. So whatever God calls us to do, he's going to do it just through us. We are the vessel, the jar of clay for him to work. All right, let's close with a prayer. Loving God, may we not only learn from these stories, but may we dig into them and see the lessons you want us to learn and the ways that we can grow in our honor to you, but also our trust and our confidence in who you are. Father, bless us as we live our lives and learn these stories. In the great name of Jesus, amen.